The cold wind cut through the busy streets as Mark pulled his coat tighter around himself. It was one of those nights where everyone hurried home, eager to escape the chill, their faces buried in scarves, their hands stuffed deep into pockets. But as he walked past the corner diner, something made him slow down. She was sitting there, hunched over, her thin jacket barely offering any protection from the wind. Her hair was tangled, her hands red from the cold, and in front of her was an empty coffee cup, not for drinking, but for collecting whatever loose change a passerby might spare. Mark had seen her before. She often sat outside this diner, never asking for anything, just sitting quietly, as if trying to be invisible. That night, something in him couldn't just walk by. Maybe it was the way her eyes looked, tired, distant, like someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Maybe it was guilt. He had a warm home waiting for him, a full fridge, and yet here she was, shivering on the sidewalk with nothing. Without thinking too much, he stepped inside the diner and ordered an extra meal. When he walked back out and handed her the bag, she looked up, surprised. "For me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Yeah, stay warm, okay?" She hesitated before taking the bag, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded like disbelief. Mark smiled and walked away, not thinking much of it. It was just a meal. After all, a small gesture. He didn't expect anything in return. But life has a strange way of bringing people back together. A week later, on a quiet evening, Mark was settling into his usual routine. He had just finished dinner. The TV hummed softly in the background, and he was about to call it a night when he heard a knock at the door. It was late. Too late for visitors. Curious and slightly cautious, he made his way to the door, unlocking it and pulling it open just enough to peek outside. And there she was, the same woman from the diner. Only this time, she wasn't sitting on the cold pavement, and she wasn't empty-handed. She was standing there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. And in her hands, wrapped carefully in worn paper, was something she was holding out to him. A gift. Mark stared at her, caught somewhere between confusion and shock. How had she found him? What was she doing here? And most of all, why was she holding a gift? He didn't know it yet, but what was inside that package would change everything. Mark stood frozen in his doorway, staring at the woman. The cold night air seeped into his home, but he barely noticed. His eyes flicked between her face and the package she held out to him. It was small, wrapped in faded brown paper, the edges slightly crumpled, as if it had been carried around for days. I wanted to give you this," she said hesitantly, her voice uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if he'd accept it. Mark finally found his voice. "How did you find me?" She shifted on her feet, glancing down for a moment. "I saw you leave the diner that night. I didn't mean to follow you. I wanted to remember the face of someone who was kind. To me." She let out a soft breath. "And I overheard you giving the cashier your name when you picked up your order. I asked around." Mark wasn't sure whether to feel uneasy or surprised by the effort she had made just to find him. But there was something about the way she stood there, the way she clutched that little package, like it was the most important thing in the world, that made him push away his hesitation. He reached out slowly and took the package from her hands. It was light, almost weightless. "What is this?" he asked, glancing back up at her. Her lips curled into the smallest smile, but there was something sad in her eyes. "Just something I think you should have." Mark hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Do you want to come in?" She blinked in surprise, as if she hadn't expected the offer. I don't want to intrude. You came all this way, he said. At least come in for a few minutes. After a brief pause, she nodded. As she stepped inside, Mark realized just how fragile she looked. The light from his apartment made it clearer. Her hollow cheeks, the exhaustion that clung to her movements. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, but life had clearly been hard on her. I'm Mark, he said, realizing they hadn't even properly introduced themselves. She smiled faintly. I know. My name is Emily. Mark gestured for her to sit as he unwrapped the package. As the paper fell away, he found himself staring at a small, delicate silver locket. It looked old, the metal slightly tarnished, but still beautiful. He gently pried it open, revealing a tiny photograph inside. A man and a little girl. Mark frowned, looking up at her. This is you? Emily nodded. Me and my dad. Her voice was quiet, distant. Mark felt a strange tightness in his chest. Why are you giving this to me? She exhaled softly, staring at the locket in his hand. Because you reminded me of him. Silence stretched between them. Mark wasn't sure what to say. Emily's fingers curled around the edge of her worn-out sweater, as if grounding herself before she spoke again. My dad used to take me to that diner when I was a kid. Back when things were good. He always said, no one should ever feel invisible. That kindness is free, and sometimes it's the only thing keeping someone going. She swallowed, her gaze fixed on the table. He passed away when I was 17, and after that, things fell apart. I lost my home, lost everything. But that night, the way you stopped, the way you saw me, it reminded me of him. Mark felt his throat tighten. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, just bought a meal. But to her, it had meant something, much bigger. I can't take this, he said, closing the locket and gently placing it back in her hands. This is yours. It's all you have of him. Emily looked down at it, her fingers running over the silver surface. It's been in my pocket for years, Mark. Every day I hold on to it, but it never brings him back. And I realized, maybe it's not about holding on to the past. Maybe it's about passing kindness forward. Mark watched her, his mind racing. He had never thought about how something as simple as a meal could mean so much to someone. He had never truly understood what it was like to be unseen, unheard, forgotten. Until now. Emily suddenly straightened, as if realizing how long she had been there. I should go. You don't have to, Mark said before he could stop himself. She smiled, but there was something distant in her eyes. I do. He wanted to say more, but she was already heading for the door. As she stepped back out into the cold, Mark called after her. Wait, Emily, she turned. Do you have somewhere to stay? She hesitated for half a second, and that told him everything he needed to know. Mark made a quick decision, one he knew he wouldn't regret. I know a shelter nearby, a good one. Let me take you there. For the first time that night, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, hope. And as they stepped out into the night together, Mark had a feeling this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Mark walked beside Emily through the quiet streets, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets to keep warm. The city felt different at this hour, emptier, almost peaceful. Yet there was an undeniable weight in the air. He could see her rubbing her arms, trying to fight off the cold. And without thinking, he slipped off his scarf and handed it to her. Here, he said. Emily hesitated before taking it. You don't have to. Just take it, he said, with a small smile. It's freezing. She gave a faint chuckle, wrapping it around herself. Thanks, Mark. They walked in silence for a moment, the shelter just a few blocks away. Mark had passed by it before. A modest building tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore, but he had never given it much thought. Now, it felt like the most important place in the world. "Have you ever stayed there before?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "No, I always meant to go, but I guess part of me was too proud. Or maybe too scared." Mark nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't before. "It's okay to need help." She didn't say anything, but he saw the way her fingers tightened around the scarf, like she was holding on to something for the first time in a long while. When they reached the shelter, the porch light cast a soft glow over the doorway. A woman at the front desk greeted them warmly, recognizing Emily immediately. "I've seen you around," the woman said gently. "I'm glad you came." Emily swallowed hard and nodded. "Me too." Mark could tell she was nervous. He wasn't sure why, but he suddenly felt reluctant to leave. It felt wrong to just drop her off and walk away. "Hey," he said, catching her gaze. "This isn't goodbye. I'll come check on you, okay?" Something in her expression shifted. Relief? Maybe. "Yeah, I'd like that." She stepped inside, and just before the door closed behind her, she turned and gave him one last look. "Mark," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded. "Anytime." And then she was gone. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at the door, before finally turning to leave. As he walked home, he found himself thinking about how everything had unfolded. It had started with something so small, one meal, one act of kindness, and yet, somehow, it had led to this. Over the next few weeks, Mark visited Emily at the shelter whenever he could. She looked better each time he saw her, more rested, more herself. She even started volunteering, helping others who were struggling just like she had been. One evening, she met him outside the shelter, a bright smile on her face. "I got a job," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. At the bookstore down the street, Mark grinned. "That's amazing, Emily." She nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I wanted you to be the first to know, because none of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night." Mark shook his head. "That's not true. You did this. You chose to walk through that door." Emily smiled, but this time there was something stronger in her expression. "Maybe, but sometimes people just need a little push to believe in themselves again." Mark thought about that as they stood there, the city buzzing quietly around them. He had never expected any of this when he handed her that meal. He had never thought it would turn into something bigger. But maybe that was the point. Kindness had a way of coming full circle. And as he walked home that night, Mark knew he would never look at the world the same way again.